Well, thanks, Sean. I'm honored and privileged to give you a little bit of the background of what I kind of do for a living here. I gave a similar talk to this class, I think 3 or 4 years ago, and I do have some new material if anybody remembers. So this is, I'll kind of go through this. But what I want to do first is kind of convince you that grasslands are very important. I'm going to spend some time trying to promote my place of business, the Konza Prairie Biological Station. I think it's very unique, and I think everyone at K-State ought to be very proud to be associated with it. And then I'm going to spend a long time talking about my research focus. I've been working at Konza Prairie since 1984, looking at the pattern, causes, and also the final consequences of what happens when we lose grasslands to woody invasion. But first, I just want to let you know that if you look at a very large picture, people aren't aware that grasslands cover about 40% of the terrestrial surface. And it's a very important ecosystem all across the world. In addition, grasslands provide an array of ecosystem services. They do a lot of things naturally, and they do it very well. Probably everyone's very familiar with the idea of grazing. There's not a grassland in this world that hasn't evolved with grazers. Grazers are important, whether they're national, they're herbivores that are present, or the introduced ones, for example, in our grasslands in the Flint Hills, a lot now being grazed by cattle. But they are well adapted to be grazed. In addition, they provide preservation for biodiversity. I'm going to go through this a little bit. They provide a lot of habitat for grasslands, plants, and animals. And because these grasslands are shrinking and endangered across the world, for example, in North America, one of the most endangered set of birds are grassland birds that depend on the grasslands to make a living. They are suffering some declines over the years. In addition, grasslands provide excellent soil erosion. Anytime you drink some nice clean water in Kansas, you ought to think of grassland. They're doing that filtering for you on that. And also, they're very important. Below ground, they store a lot of carbon. Carbon storage is extremely important, but also why grasslands are endangered. We're mining that stored carbon underground every time we plant agricultural crops. That's why one of the reasons grasslands are endangered. In North America, it was one of the largest biomes in North America, and there's a nice gradient of different types of grasslands depending upon the rainfall pattern. But if we look at where the current grasslands are at now, at least in the Tallgrass Prairie, less than 5% of the original Tallgrass Prairie still is left in North America. Whoops. And if we look at internationally, again, going back to this large picture, everybody is very probably familiar with endangered ecosystem. They think instantly of the Amazon, the rainforest, etc. But this is some work, it's getting kind of old, 2005, but still very true. If we look at the conversion of native habitat and how much of that native habitat is set aside in preserves or national parks so that are protected, temperate grasslands, which include the Tallgrass Prairie, come up at the top. Only about 4.6% of the habitat is protected, even though it was a very large area. So this is why grasslands, particularly temperate grasslands, the grasslands that we're around every day, are some of the most endangered ecosystems in the world. In addition, this is a more recent report done by the Wildlife Federation, where they looked at North American grasslands. This is Tallgrass Prairie, Midgrass Prairie, Northern Prairie, and literally found that in the last 6 to 7 years, we have lost a grasslands the size of Kansas. Grasslands are still being converted to agricultural practices, particularly in the northern tier on that. A lot of this is being done for the production of corn and soybeans. So a lot of the, anytime there's that conversion of grasslands, it's usually to an agricultural crop in the northern part. Here, what I'm going to go through is a little bit different. But to put it in perspective, in the Great Plains, in the same period of time, we've lost more grasslands than has been conversion to the Brazilian Amazon. Kind of put it in perspective. So this loss of grasslands is still going on in this national scale. Now, if we now shrink back down, we look at the original map of the Tallgrass Prairie, the mixed prairie, the shortgrass prairie. That just follows a precipitation gradient. So you go from grasses that can literally be 6 to 8 feet tall in this part of the world. You go start getting to salina, you're getting the mixed grass prairie, where it's going to get maybe knee high. By the time you're to the Colorado border, you're in shortgrass prairie, might get a little ankle high. So it does follow this precipitation gradient. Now, the largest remaining tract of tallgrass prairie is in this geological formation called the Kansas Flint Hills. It literally almost goes from Nebraska, goes down through to a little bit in Nebraska. And over there to the right, you can kind of see a little bit more in some of the preserves where we're at. And up the top, you can see where the Konza Prairie Biological Station is at the very top, but the Nature Conservancy has some other place. But this represents the largest remaining tract of native tallgrass prairie. And I would like to say that's been preserved because Kansans were great conservationists. That's not true at all. It's not a farmland because they can't plow it. It's too rocky, the soil are shallow. That white out there is not a bad slide, that's just all the limestone rock on there. And very early on, people who lived in this part of the world realized that they could make more money raising cattle instead of trying to farm this. And if you look at it, even though we put this outline of the tallgrass prairie, the Flint Hills, doesn't mean it's solid grasslands. You can see how it's broken up. It's all fragmented. Every time with roads, we have the different residential areas. And what the Nature Conservancy is trying to do is set aside a lot of these, either by purchasing the land like they have in the Tallgrass Prairie Preserve down around Strong City, the Konza Prairie, but they're also setting up some easements. And what those are conservation easements. A family will decide that once the owner of the land passed away, that land can only be used for agricultural purposes in a steady state. It can't be converted over to an apartment complex. And so a lot of people are doing that in the Kansas Nature Conservancy, the Livestock Association, Kansas Farm Bureau. It's a real nice cooperative wildlife. And the idea being they're trying to set aside these grasslands, because all of these grasslands are in private ownership. About 90% of it is. And if you're a private owner, you can do anything you want to with that land. So they're trying to preserve it in that way. So now let's go on back to Konza Prairie. So how many people here have been to Konza and know where it's at? All right, so I can go really fast through this part. It's very unique. It's privately owned, most of it. Catherine Ordway, from an heir of 3M Company, she donated about $3.5 million in the 70s and purchased it. It was a working cattle ranch right up until it was purchased. And then she The first tract of land she gave to the KSU Foundation. The other tract of land, the Nature Conservancy still has the title to it, so it's privately owned. So about 80% of the land is owned by the Nature Conservancy. It is leased to Kansas State, the Division of Biology, and our lease agreement says that what we do is we pay taxes and insurance on that land. Because the Nature Conservancy tries to be a good neighbor, and if we would take that big chunk of land out of the tax roll, people in the area would be hurt. So the agreement is we pay the taxes. It's about 8,600 acres, give or take a bit. And it is very unique as a Nature Conservancy site in that the agreement, the original director, Lloyd Holbert, set it up to be a long-term research area. It's not a preserve. We do some things out there that people kind of cringe at. We have backhoes out there digging holes to look at soils and things like that. So it is a major research station set aside. It has three main goals: long-term ecological research, conservation practices for Tallgrass Prairie, and also the education program. And I have some of the kind of the big things there. It's brought in around $80 million. The state of Kansas provides 2.5 staff members to take care of Konza Prairie. The rest is all generated by user's fee. If people want to work at Konza and they have a research grant, they have to pay to work out there. So it is self-sustaining in a lot of different ways. We have a lot of research going on, over 1,500 scientific publications, a lot of students. I'm most proud of the graduate students. I've been there so long that graduate students who got their degree here are faculty members. They're bringing back their graduate students to work here. And I told myself, if those students now come back, I hope I'm long gone by that time. So my biggest problem at Konza is we can't get rid of people. People love to work out at Konza. The other thing I'm very proud of is that we do something that most universities don't do. We're heavily involved with the K through 12 program. We actively research with kids. We have grants to pay for school buses. Right now, school districts literally can't come to Konza because they can't afford the bus trip. And so we've been able to get funds. We have about 3,000 or 4,000 kids come out in this area, go out to Konza on an annual basis. Now, Konza is an experimental station. Big thing is fire. There's three things that make a prairie, especially Tallgrass Prairie: fire, grazing, and climate. We are in a very unique part of this world in which we have enough precipitation in most years that woody vegetation, trees can grow in this area. Okay? But the Tallgrass Prairie is fire-derived and fire-maintained. It's a lot different than most places. You put a fence around a Tallgrass Prairie, you walk away from it, do nothing. In about 20 or 30 years, you're not going to have a Tallgrass Prairie. You have to actively manage it with either fire and or grazing. And so what we've done is set up this big experiment. It makes my life extremely fun or exciting or difficult, depending on which day of the week it is. But we've taken this area, we've broken it up into units called watersheds, and each one of those watersheds has a different treatment on it. For example, 1D, that's an area that's ungrazed. Grazers are excluded from it, and it's burnt annually in the springtime. Across the fence from it, we have a herd of American bison, around 300 head, reintroduced in that. And we have it burned at either a 1-year burn, 2-year, 4, or 20. All those numbers correspond to the fire return intervals. And of course, then you have to have the other extreme. You have to have some areas that have a very low fire frequency. 20B, that's burnt once about every 20 years. And then we also have areas grazed by cattle. And we also have some seasonal burns. Most of our burning occurs in the springtime. Come the 1st of March, we'll be burning. Takes us about 12 or 14 days. We start by March 1. We're lucky to be done by May 1, simply because we're limited by weather. With the interstate along the southern end, we have to have a south wind to burn some of those watersheds. On the east side, you have 177. We have to have an east wind, which is the rarest wind in Kansas, because usually when you get an east wind, you get rain. And then if we're burning up at the northern part, we want a north wind so that we don't burn, our neighbors don't like it when fire gets too close to their houses for some reason. So it's a manipulation. We have to make a day-to-day decision on how we do the burning. And for using this experimental design, we have almost 40 years of data where we've been looking at this impact of fire, grazing, and of course living in Kansas, climate variability. As I always tell people, if you look at the average temperature of Manhattan, Kansas, it's pretty wonderful. It's pretty close to San Diego, California. It's the variance that gets you. So we can have warm days and cold days on that, hot and dry. All right, so again, just a kind of reminder on these fires. We also have not only springtime, but we have winter and fall. We just last week did some our winter burns, and then everybody's favorite burn is the summer burns. You go out there in July, it's 90 degrees, 80% humidity, and you get a set of fire. How much more fun could that be on that? So I'll go a little bit on that. In addition, we have some fire reversal experiments going on where we've let the woody vegetation come into it. Then we ask a very simple question. If we reintroduce fire by itself, is that adequate? Can we restore that prairie just using fire? And I'll try to get to that a little bit longer. But hopefully get you some idea on that. Again, with the grazing, the bison have been there since about '87. We maintain a constant density of animals. We try to remove around 25% of the productivity that's produced out there. That number is kind of our estimate of what happens in native systems when you have native herbivores. Those bison are out there year-round. They do not get any supplemental food on that. In addition, most recently, we have reintroduced some cattle out on Konza, and we're doing a patch burn grazing. Using our results from the bison data, what we do is we divide up the land in 3 sections, 3 pastures, and we burn 1/3 of that every year. But we stock the entire pasture like all of it's burnt. And what happens is the cattle will concentrate on that burnt area that first year. Then the next year we burn the adjacent pasture, and the 3rd year. So you just rotate that out, and so it kind of more simulates, we hope, what had happened in the past. And we're working with Casey Olson from Animal Science, and so we know that will increase the heterogeneity, but the big question a rancher wants to know is, how much money am I going to lose if I do this? So we're trying to get some answers on, can you make a living and also have some conservation purposes in your grazing? And after 6 years, it looks like that's the case. We've had a pretty good drought in 2012. We were able to keep the cattle on there. So there's a lot of potential for the patch burn. Is it the way everybody should operate their system? No way. It's a lot more work. It's a lot harder to burn little patches than it is one big one. So for some ranchers, they might not be able to do it, but we're trying to come up with some solutions to kind of help them. Okay. So finally, what I want to do in the remaining time is talk about this conversion. Everybody is is familiar with deforestation, cutting down a forest, which is a serious problem. Overall, if you look nation and worldwide, because we have some studies going on with folks from South Africa, every grassland in the world is now being threatened by a conversion of grasslands to woodlands. Some areas it's non-native plants. In this part of the world, it's all this native, all the invasions by these trees, woody plants are all native plants. There's not a non-native plant invading. And in this part of the world, there's a variety of systems. Number one, the gallery forest expansion. There's always been trees in this part of the world. Even settlers, when they came through, they called this the Great American Desert, always talked about having some trees. They saw deer, they saw turkeys, but most of those trees were associated with the streams, permanent water. And a University of Kansas geographer in the 20s kind of coined those as gallery forest, because they were very small, narrow stretches of forest that just hugged the water field, that creek. It reminded them of a gallery in a ship. So this kind of name kind of sticks. So when we talk about gallery forest, we're talking about water in a stream and the associated trees. And you go out there, the trees are very common, what you see in the eastern deciduous forest. We have oaks, hickories, sycamore, cottonwoods, etc. So very common, but they're very restricted. More recently, we also have some woody shrub encroachment. Again, I'm going to go in more detail. You're going to know more about shrubs than you probably ever want to know here in a little bit. But also another one that people are very familiar with, I hope, if you drive around here, is eastern red cedar, Juniper virginiana. This is the only native conifer that is in Kansas. And we've had a rapid expansion of these in the last 40 or 50 years. Not only in Kansas, but in Oklahoma and Texas. Some colleagues of mine at Oklahoma State call it the green glacier. Just like a glaciers before came across the Great Plains, now we have this green glacier of cedar trees literally coming from the south and starting to move north on that. And a very common tree, you can see borderline, fence line situations, very easily controlled with fire. And also they're a very good tree. I don't see how anything could live on soil depths around 4 to 6 inches, but those things are able to do that. They're a very drought tolerant tree. I had a student of mine way back whenever started documenting the expansion, and what he was able to do is take aerial photographs of the same places and literally document how fast these trees can move in. And he found within 40 to 50 years, you can go from native tallgrass prairie to an area that's dominated by one species. Even I can identify all the species there. It's juniper and small junipers. It just becomes a monoculture. And you can also see literally how important the human factors are. These two areas are getting the same amount of CO2, they're getting the same amount of precipitation. The difference is fire is being applied to this pasture land. This piece of land was set aside. They're trying to develop it for residential housing, so they let the trees come into that. And we have examples of that, Tatarac's Hills, real close by. And again, that photograph that I had earlier is just all present. You can just drive around Manhattan, and if you see a bunch of cedar trees, you know fire hasn't been there in a long time. In addition to red cedars coming in, and again, that's the total absence of fires. Once any cedar that's about my size or shorter, if you have any fuel at all, it will burn up. They do not resprout. They're very easily controlled by fire at the early stage. When they get up really large, and it takes a fire that you don't want to be around to get rid of them. But the other more interesting and really surprising thing people ask in 40 years of research at Konza, what has been the most surprising thing? And it has to be the fact that when we set up Konza, Lloyd Hurlbut, the first director of Konza, set up Konza, he talked to Clinton Owensby, and Clinton, because we knew back in the 70s that if you didn't burn Tallgrass Prairie, you got woodlands. Ranchers have known that for a long area. And Clinton and Lloyd talked a long time, and Clinton goes, what would be really interesting is to look at the fire frequency. Look at 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, 4 year, 10 and 20 year burn frequency to kind of see. And we hypothesized when we first set up Konza and set it up, we hypothesized that a 4-year burn cycle would be the best thing for Tallgrass Prairie. Because if you annually burn, you get nothing but grasses, which is why ranchers want to do that, but you decrease the number of forbs, the pretty plants, the pretty flowers that are out there, and of course you reduce the trees. So we thought a 3 to 4 year burn cycle would be ideal. You would be burning frequent enough to keep out the cedar trees, but you would be able to get a lot of pretty flowers. And much to our surprise, on this unit 4B, which have a little notation, we have a 3-year burn interval, which means that we never had a wildfire at Konza. We've always had a fire that exceeded our expectations for that day. So you got to learn how to spin things. So this particular watershed has been burnt on a 3-year because we had a fire getaway to it. We have permanent plots, 1983. You go out there in the lowlands, 8% woody cover. This is a photograph now of what it looks like. Over 76% woody cover. This is in an ungrazed area, a lot of fuel, so the fires are relatively hot, and we're still getting this large increase, which has really been a big surprise to us. And why is that? Well, Zach Razadak, we have the data that goes through that, and he's come up with some criteria how these shrubs can do it. These again, these are native plants. They're well adapted to fire. And this just kind of shows the increase of what's happening over time on that. And so, what are some of the traits that they have? The plants that are increasing are clonal, which means that they're reproducing asexually, and they resprout. You burn them, and instead of one sprout coming up, you get 2 or 3 coming up. In addition, the ones that are growing the fastest also have very deep roots. They have shallow roots so they can compete with the grasses, but they also have deeper roots. And Jesse Nippert has done the stable isotopes and shows that over the season, growing season, that these shrubs are taking water from different sources in the grasses. So they can literally start getting at the water that the grasses can't get to. And again, as you might guess, as those woody plants increase, you get a decrease in grass cover. Those grasses are very competitive. However, the shrubs can grow, once they get up to a certain size, they start shading them so they're not able to get the light, and the cover of the dominant grasses do decrease. And just to give you some idea, kind of a picturesque form of this, we've taken 3 watersheds at Konza. The first one is at 1D that gets burnt every year. It's a very boring watershed, but it's very picturesque, nice flowering grasses. Is dominated by 3 or 4 tall grass species and little dots of woody vegetation that persist in that landscape, even with annual fire. They've always been part of this landscape, but they are able to adapt. They move around. Most of them are dispersed by birds. They have the seeds and they get dropped randomly across there. And then that middle one is 4B, that one that I showed you a picture of. You can see back in '81 when it was just still almost a cattle ranch, very few woody plants. This bottom one is 20B, only one fire occurred in that time frame, and you can see a tremendous increase. That 4-year burn that looked almost exactly like the 20-year burn with response to the shrubs. So a big increase in these woody plants. And again, we're talking about an ungrazed area, a lot of fuel, so the fires are good and hot. But if we zero in, the big difference on 20B is a red cedar, just as I mentioned before. In 1981, it was real easy to count the cedar trees. There wasn't anything out there. 2012, we had almost 1,200 cedars out there. So they move in very quickly on that. Just kind of reiterate what I mentioned earlier. And again, why are these shrubs responding? This is some work from one of my graduate students where we took little shrub islands, little pockets of shrubs. Some we burnt, others we built little aluminum shelters around them so the fire couldn't go through. Then at the end of the year, she not only collected ticks by being out there, but she counted every individual stem. And much to our surprise, she found that these shrubs, particularly Cornus drummondii, likes to be burned. What this shows over 2 years, if you protect it, you get that green line, it resprouts, but if it gets burnt, those number of stems just really increase over time. And this is what's going on. This burning is stimulating that increase. And so the first thing we thought about was, well, okay, what's going on here? Maybe it's the fire thing. And we think of fire as being binary. It's either burnt or it's not burned. But we know there's different kinds of fires. You can have a backfire, burning against the wind, which can be cool. If you don't have much fuel, it's also going to be cool. So we wanted to know what was the impact of fire temperatures. So again, some work for some of my graduate students. I don't do anything. I just get to report on them. I make them do all the work and get all the ticks and stuff. I just kind of reap all the glory that they do. And so these were some fire temperature. We set out some probes. You have a grassland area, temperatures can get very hot, but it's very quick on that. This is the time or frame. The thing about those woody plants is there's not much fine fuel in there. So you can literally have this raging fire going across the landscape. It hits those shrubs and the temperatures really break down, drop down. So they're literally, those fires are not operating the same way going through those shrub islands as do the grasslands. So we had this crazy idea, well, let's do something about that. So what we did was we put a bunch of grass. We took a bunch of hay and just stuck it in these shrub islands, thinking, okay, we're going to get us a really hot fire. We're going to burn those babies up. That's what we need to do. And so this kind of gets some things we put, you can tell 400 grams versus almost 2,500 grams per square meter on that. So we really put a lot of fuel in there. We did some fancy temperatures. We picked a modern day. And the bottom line is it kind of worked. Here's the grasslands. We were able, in those shrub islands with the fuel, we got it hotter, and we also got that fire to last longer too. So we really put a lot of heat on that. But what happened, we put more fuel on that and those darn things grew faster. They are just amazing on that. So this is a one-year experiment. So that's a problem with a master's student. They like to graduate and leave. And I say, well, do it one more summer. And they look at me as they're going out the door on that. And so we can now kind of go back. Remember I talked about this fire reversal. Can fire alone replace this? And so we've done this. We have about 20 years of data. And the bottom line is, maybe. This again in an ungrazed area. And this cartoon kind of represents my data analysis at this time. We're trying to get this paper out. But the bottom line is we can increase the grass cover. And literally what I call this is that Mexican hat. You have a very tall shrub. You start putting fire through there every year. The shrubs get smaller, but they spread out across the landscape. And so if you're like me and you stand by the fire guard out there, you don't get out in there, and you look and you think, hey, that fire's doing pretty good. There's no shrubs. Then when I send my students out to collect the data, they find all these little stems across the landscape. They're just sitting there on there, so they're persisting in our landscape. For after 20 years of annual burning, we're not able to convert this tallgrass prairie that's been invaded by woodlands back to tall grass. So it's going to take more drastic nature. It's going to take mechanical methods or herbicides. And so the latter part of this is, again, trying to scale back up, trying to use this data from Konza, what's going to be the future of this beloved tallgrass prairie. This is some data from Doug Gooden and Brett Moeller. I think Brett was his student of his, where they combined looking at remote sensing data, coming up with some ideas of what's the frequency of burning across the Flint Hills. Konza data was used to kind of help calibrate that. And you can see the different fire intervals. Some places are burnt every 2 years. Some aren't burnt very much at all. And the good thing is he's been able also to kind of come up with some estimates of how many acres, what are the percentages. And you can really see what happens in a drought season. 12, these were 2 years, 11 and 12 were drought years. So the following years you don't have any grass because there's nothing left there to burn. So there's on that, so you get a big reduction, but you also see this fluctuation over time. So we used this data coupled with our results at Konza and did some scenarios. What would happen to this tallgrass prairie? We're not looking at any climate change, which really complicates things. But what would happen if you just change one variable? What if you just change the fire frequency? Okay, and using that, using our data from Konza, we think about a 1 to 3 year fire frequency is necessary to maintain tallgrass prairie. If you increase this and start getting a shrub land type situation, if you, instead of burning every 3 years, you go up to 8. And then if you go beyond greater than 8 years, then we go back to red cedar forest that's happening. And so we took this information, applied that to a model, worked with Doug again, and came up with this scenario of what would happen. And basically, if fire frequency changes, we estimate about 70% of the tallgrass prairie remaining in the Flint Hills is going to be converted based upon historical fire frequency. So it is necessary for us to increase our fire frequency in the Flint Hills if we're going to save the remaining prairie. However, things are never easy. You have fire, you have smoke, and smoke is a serious management issue. Carol can give you nightmares of trying to develop with this. This is very important. This is one of my favorite things in 2014 from Lincoln, Nebraska. On April 18th, had the worst air pollution of all North American cities that particular day. Even worse than LA, that's 10 times larger, all that kind of stuff. Everybody knows about the air quality of California. And you say, well, what happened? Well, the Flint Hills happened. This is a photograph of satellite data from that day before. Each one of those red dots represents a fire. And it so happened the wind was blowing just perfect and Lincoln got hit with our fires. When we burn in the Flint Hills, we can cause problems in Kansas City, Topeka, Wichita, Lincoln, Omaha, Chicago, and even St. Louis on that. So our fires in our area have regional problems, and we are being asked, and there's models out there that ranchers can use to try to reduce that, but it is a serious problem. So we're saying we need to burn more, but yet the cities are saying you can't burn anymore because that's going to create problems for us. And so what's the solution? To me, the only practical solution is we have this smoke problem because everybody likes to burn on the same day. You get a nice weekend in April. The winds are perfect. It's a warm day. And everybody who's been here and knows, just one day, everything just, it looks like hell out there. Smoke is everywhere. It doesn't look good. And so if we're going to continue to save this tallgrass prairie, using our data from our fire seasonal things, our data suggests that if you burn in spring, summer, fall, or winter, you're still going to get tallgrass prairie. So we're going to have to change our mindset in the Flint Hills and spread out our burning season if we're going to save this tallgrass prairie. Okay, so kind of in summary, if you don't burn tallgrass prairie in 40 years, you're going to have a forest. Pretty simple. This woody vegetation that's out there, really, they're well adapted to fire, particularly if they're deep-rooted. They're very clonal. Almost all of these plants will resprout. 20 years of data on Konza has shown that once these shrubs are well established, fire alone will not remove them. And fire is the cheapest thing. We're talking pennies per acre to maintain a fire. If you start going mechanical or herbicides, you're talking hundreds of dollars an acre. And to a rancher, a farmer, that's just ridiculous on that. We have a cautionary note that if we're not start increasing our burning in the Flint Hills, we're going to lose the last remaining tract of tallgrass prairie. And of course, what I ended up with is if we do that, we're going to create a bunch of problems. So one of the possible solutions is that we need to start spreading out this time period of burning. Now that's easier said than done. There's a lot of tradition of burning in the spring. The impacts on cattle ranching, other things are very serious situations, but it's something that needs more investigation, more work to kind of get a handle on that. And I think that is my last slide. Everybody says, thank goodness. All right.